Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to speak about this work. Let's get going. So, next time I'm going to remember to send a shorter bio so we don't have to read as much. But again, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee, and we have a location here at the College of Social Work behind Tribeca University. If you didn't know, now you know. All right. So a little bit about what I want to discuss, and if I could be given like a signal, then when it's like 1 minute left and time to cut me off, you'll let me know. Okay, thank you, appreciate it. And I just want to tell you a bit about what restorative justice practices are, and I'll tell you a bit about what I've learned about best practices, and thinking about challenges of facilitating this kind of intervention in a larger school. So why even do this work? Well, nationally, what we know are a lot of kids are missing school for various reasons, including school suspension. So nationally, from the Office of Civil Rights gives us some of this data that 2.8 million one or more out-of-school suspensions were meted during the 2016-2017 academic year. We know that compared to their white peers, Black K-12 students are suspended 3.8 times more. And Black girls account for 8% of enrollment, but 13% of students receiving a suspension. Can you hear me over here? Okay, that's great, it works. And so we know that for many young, students of color in general, they're disproportionately suspended. But let's talk about what's happening within the state. So I took this from the Office of Civil Rights website. You can use it too. They have really cool tools so that you can even narrow down to your particular school. So let me just explain what we have here. You see these different colors. The turquoise color to the left is all students, and the purple one is students of color. So we know here for school suspensions, this is just one suspension, data from the 2017 academic year, that students of color are more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. For example, they're turquoise all the way to the right. I see that there's some colors that are duplicate, but if you can see from afar, they are labeled. All right. So just looking at this same concept across race and gender, right, where the left chart is for males and the right is for females, we also see some variation, and this is looking at least one school suspension. And what we find is that our students of color have higher rates of school suspensions. We're looking at about 6.5% for students of color, and let's see, that's almost 9% compared to all their enrollment. So what we're looking at here, the difference is disproportional representation in their being suspended. Likewise, just thinking about it in terms of who's receiving more than one school suspension, multiple school suspensions, right? And so as we think about that, that means missing class. And so there's a problem there. So again, why is this important? You know, because oftentimes when we think about students being suspended, it's like, well, you were cutting up in class, weren't you? Right? And that's one scenario. We have to recognize that sometimes our young people need to learn to listen, right? But there are other things that we're concerned about. And that's one, of course, the impact on their academics and missing class. School suspensions are associated with higher dropout rates. In terms of their relationships now, there's a depreciated student-teacher relationships, increased likelihood of antisocial behavior. So let me say this. I've yet to find the study that says when kids are suspended, they behave better. I've not seen it yet. Email it to me. Oftentimes, they're at home playing video games or what have you, right? So we don't see that happening. And then behaviorally, we know that it's connected to repeat future suspensions. So they're like, I could play more video games maybe, who knows? But sometimes, because they're labeled maybe as a bad kid, the kid that gets suspended, they're like, well, might as well walk into it, right? So that's this concept of labeling theory. And then there's greater chance for later incarceration, right? And so here's this tool that we initially wanted to use to obviously create safety in schools and create correction, but we haven't seen yet that school suspensions are corrective. So there are a variety of interventions that have been discussed. They look like restorative justice practices, which I'll describe. They're aimed to encourage accountability and harm reduction, and mostly repairing relationships and mending and building community. There's positive behavioral intervention systems, monarch rooms, which focus on de-escalation, push-in rooms, because the concept is that they're being pushed out, right? So student-driven protocol to de-escalate. That student-driven piece is really cool because at some point you're like, look, how can we walk this walk together? Let's come up with what's going to work for both of us, right? And so some push-in ideas about co-constructing environment with the students, and the sanctuary model, which is integrating some of these trauma-informed protocol. So again, a bit about restorative practices and why I've been studying it. The way that sometimes discipline happens is that it may be focused on being punitive, something that happens to a child. Sometimes discipline is permissive. It's sort of like, well, natural consequences, which can be helpful, but at the same time, if a student gets away with something, they say, well, I can do that again, right? But then we also have, and then there's neglectful, not supporting behavior infractions at all. But then the idea with restorative practices that you're again co-constructing, you're building community with that young person. So you're doing discipline with young people. Now, I use this image here because honestly, when I talk to educators, they're like, what intervention this year? Right? Next year is going to be another one. The other year it's going to be another one. And then all of a sudden, like, teachers are feeling like they're balancing so much at one time. And so, you know, I think it's important to stick with one as a school, if you think that it's evidence-based, to stick with that so that there can be some consistency. What we know from research, it takes about 3 to 5 years for one intervention for us to start seeing the effect of it. So if you have an intervention only for 2 years and you're like, it didn't work, well, it takes a little time for it to happen, and sometimes when we make teachers juggle like this, it's not going to happen, right? And, you know, they feel overwhelmed. Dear God, I appreciate your confidence in my ability to handle difficult situations, but my plate is full. There's so much going on in our schools, so many interventions. We're coming from different walks of life. You know, we have our own, I mean, let's be honest. Think about the way you receive discipline at home. Is it different than what you're expected to do at school? Most likely, right? It's a bit different. And so there's so much hoop jumping, right? And thinking about those mental gymnastics of how to make it work. But what I say is, with all these interventions that we have to think about how we tie it all together. What are the key points that you need for your particular school or particular schools in a community? So again, thinking about restorative practices, what they are it's a multi-tiered intervention, meaning you can have level 1 for basic infractions and level 3, so to speak, where we can deal with more clinical levels, where school counselors, psychologists, or social workers would be helping with intervening. So thinking back to that multiple school suspensions chart, we don't want young people being suspended multiple times, right? It's a waste of everyone's time. But how can we use this intervention and thinking about the higher tier of the intervention to make sure that they're getting the clinical support they need, socio-emotional support they need, so on and so forth. And the idea is this, it's less about being punitive, but meeting that person, that young person, where they are. I'll talk a bit about what it looks like through circles. If you've ever done group work, it looks like having a conversation in a group. In the classroom, that's what it looks like. And so, at least from this model of restorative practices, from the International Institute of Restorative Practices, they have a spectrum of what restorative practices can look like. So they're affective statements. That's the way you're going to be talking to that young person and letting them know how their behavior might have been impacting you or your classroom, right? So you're meeting them at that emotion, all the way to a formal conference. I've been through a formal conference. That's when mom and dad are called in, right? That's when the guardians, I've even had pastor come in, right, to the circle and say, like, how do we do this intervention together, right? And I've seen those formal conferences mostly when there's, say, a big fight. And And that formal conference was so powerful because these young people in the school I'm thinking about came from a place where that fight may have led to gang violence when they got back home. And that formal conference needed to happen to make sure that everyone was safe when they got home. And I remember it was so powerful seeing that circle because initially, you know, each kid on each side would stay on their side of the circle, and the facilitator got them to say, oh no, we're gonna switch seats. We're not picking sides, you're gonna switch it up. I don't care who you represent, you're gonna switch it up and sit next to each other. And at the end, after we had conversation, the young man says, I just don't wanna have to watch my back when I leave here. And they made a truce. That was beautiful to see, right? But there's beauty in trained facilitation, and that's what I witnessed a facilitator doing. So you may not see this from here, but what are affective statements? They can be, I am so proud to see and hear, X. I'm appreciative of you for doing Y. Because oftentimes, when we're busy in classrooms, maybe even in your own family, if you have a few children, there's the one child that always gets your attention. Always. But then your child who's usually doing what they're supposed to do, they may not hear, I'm proud of you, you're doing the right thing. And that's part of what Restorative Practices does. It says, let's not just only look at when kids are not doing what they're not supposed to do, but let's create models and opportunities and affirm good behavior, right? And so these are some examples of what affective statements can be. Even, I'm concerned about X, you know? So the list can go on, and this can be created for any school, for any classroom, for any family. Again, restorative practices are multi-tiered, where tier 1 can look like a universal level, community building circles. I've seen circles that says, like, what'd you do this weekend? What's your favorite ice cream? And let me tell you, the question of what did you do this weekend is really important, because if something exciting happened and the kids want to talk about it and you don't give space, they're going to talk about it anyway. So if you give space for them to talk about it, the hope is that it would disrupt your classroom a little less. All right, we'll skip that. So the idea, it's all about relationship building. I've seen firsthand when educators say to me, wow, having these circles regularly, and the principal said, hey, every Monday is restorative practice. The first quarter or first period is going to be a restorative circle. Start the week off that way. The kids can start talking about sort of what are their plans and their expectations for the week. And in doing that, the teachers felt like they learned the students' names faster, which is really important for children to feel that they've developed rapport with their teacher, right? And then the kids learn more about each other. So it's all about relationship development, especially if it's done consistently, right? So it's used to build healthy relationships, to reduce and prevent and improve reduce harmful behavior, repair harm, restore, resolve conflict, and address and discuss the needs of the school and the community. It's about calling kids in. It's about co-constructing the community that you want together. But I'm going to throw a wrench in it, and that is schools that have been using restorative practices to reduce racially disproportional school suspensions have found that it's still hard to reduce the discipline gap. That means they're still seeing some level of racially disproportional school suspensions. So I have an idea about why that's happening, and that's part of what I've been investigating in some of my work. And asking these kind of questions, I'll tell you what I've come up with. Maybe a little hard to see in an article that I wrote with 2 students at University of Tennessee. We talked about some barriers that school leaders find in just implementing it for the first time. And so some barriers include, let me see if I can pull up my notes. Well, one of the first ones is that some teachers say, it's taking up too much time, right? I don't have time to run a circle and have these conversations. I just need the students to come to my class and pay attention and listen. But, you know, sometimes what I'm seeing with the data is that when you make time for it, the circles actually go faster. The students have gotten off their chest what they needed to say, and then you get to say what you need to say. So some of the barriers are policies. In one of the schools I was at, there was still this idea that if you were late to class, if you were late to school, that you got to after-school detention. All right, but some of the kids that we served at that school, they had to go home and watch a brother or sister, or they had a job, right, to help home with the family, so they couldn't stay for after-school detention, so that means they got an immediate one-day suspension. So here's the school trying to be restorative, but the child's late to school regularly because they're helping their brother or sister get to school, and they're getting daily one-day suspensions. Make it make sense, right? We can't be restorative and still have punitive policies, so it means policies need to change, some practices need to change. Sometimes it's poor training. Honestly, this is something, like I said, that takes 3 to 5 years to see good implementation and see good results, but the trainings are usually 1 or 2 days. And I know there's not usually more time than that to train our educators and administrators to do the work. As I mentioned, lack of time, poor implementation, and then biases. We're all human, we have them. And if you implement something like this without also knowing yourself, right, understanding how your lived experiences have informed what you believe about gender, about race, about sexuality, it's going to show up in the decisions you make about discipline. All right. Facilitators have included support from administrators, adequate funding, consistently applying restorative practices, asking the right type of circle questions. So if by week 8 you're still asking them what's their favorite ice cream, students are going to get fed up, right? So you got to keep them engaged, and one way to do that is ask them to submit questions about what they want to talk about. Then they get really excited because their question got pulled for the day. So I'll show you. One teacher said, I'd say it's a time it takes, and you have to be okay that you're losing that time. The first 2 weeks of doing it, it was like pulling teeth, but now it looks like it will take 10 minutes or less. The first few weeks, it was like 20 to 25 minutes, right? So that's a horror for most educators to say, 20 to 25 minutes of my period, are you kidding me, right? We'll be so behind. But this particular teacher found that eventually the kids understood the ropes and got it done, and she got their attention. And as I mentioned, one student said, we do circles for every and everything. For example, what is your favorite color? This isn't building community. We're 3 months in and we shouldn't be asking that. So again, co-constructing a space for them to talk about things that are important to them. These are again some facilitators, having a mentoring block, so having a dedicated time that you can facilitate restorative practices, integrating it into the curriculum, co-constructing circles, so on and so forth. In another article my colleagues and I have written, we talked about how this restorative practices takes interprofessional collaboration. That's the school social workers working with the educators, working with the administrators, right? It looks like not ignoring the fact that we have our own conceptions about race and racism, and how does that show up in what we think about discipline, about our students. Challenging dominant perspectives, all right? Valuing the students' experiential knowledge. Again, that's co-constructing what the rules should look like. Obviously, we're not going to have them create rules that will cause disruption, but making sure that their voices count in that moment. And having a social justice framework. Understanding that even with your best intentions as a person in that young person's life, that we don't always live in a very just world. What are they experiencing and facing out of the school walls? What are they facing inside? And so that's where I start to think about, well, how do we become trauma-informed in the way that we're doing school discipline? Understanding that depending on the community they're coming from or the household they're coming from, they're coming with sometimes a full backpack, right, of hardships and difficulties they've had to experience before they came to your classroom. So I asked the question, if we were to say that we know that race is a concept that exists, and the reason why I bring this up is oftentimes schools will try to reduce racially disproportional school suspensions with a great intervention like restorative justice or positive behavior intervention systems, but everybody's quiet, nobody wants to talk about race because it makes people feel uncomfortable, right? And so it's important to recognize that we can't address a problem if we're not willing to talk about it. And there are many ways to do that work. And so part of what I say is if we know that race is a concept that exists, we know that racism is a concept that exists, then we should be asking, practitioners should be asking themselves some specific questions. So for example, What identity-based stressors are my students experiencing in society? Are the students' identity markers different from mine, and how might this impact what the student is experiencing in the school setting? And what are my biases, and how do they interfere with my beliefs about that student? You don't have to tell anybody, but you should write it down and reflect on it and figure out what you need to do to work on that. And that's what I support with educators. That's what I support with my students. Social work students who are going to come into the community and do their best to make a difference in people's lives. But if my students have biases about people who are experiencing poverty, and all they can say is, well, just work hard and you'll get there, well, that's a part of the scenario, but there's more to that, right? And in the same way, that's what educators need to do, right? Administrators need to do, is recognize that there's more to the story. I ask another question about challenging the dominant perspective, and we'll go to number 3 here at the bottom. Is there an expectation for students of color to exhibit resilience and grit in the face of trauma compared to their white peers? Do we expect resilience, yet ignore intervention? Do we reward trauma-related resilience and punish maladaptive coping? Because sometimes that's what we're seeing. We're seeing them show up and coping in the best way they know how, and that might be talking out of turn, that might be fidgeting, right? That might look like raising their voice, that might be wearing their favorite colored shirt that day because grandma gave it to them, knowing good and well that shirt is out of uniform, right? Depending on the school they go to. But it looks like many things, and the way we get to know that is through relationship. It's through relationship. So I think I got the marker. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes, okay. So why this also matters is there's so many changes happening across the country as it relates to schools considering and states considering the role of trauma-informed care in practice. So we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, which delivers a charge for schools to develop trauma-informed training, which we know a lot of schools are doing, and I know that in Metro that's happening. But I found it really interesting, the Peter P. et al. In Compton case, and I'm going to read a quick excerpt for you, which says, the plaintiffs contend that defendants have ignored and affirmatively breached their responsibility to accommodate students whose access to education is fundamentally impaired by reason of the trauma they have endured. Rather, defendants are alleged to have subjected trauma-impacted students to punitive and counterproductive suspensions, expulsions, and involuntary transfers. So now we see there's starting to be some legal precedents to say that schools have a responsibility now to make sure that we are understanding the communities and the adversities that the young people are coming from. And so discipline practices, as they have been, are not going to fit anymore. And it's time to start changing what that looks like. Because as I said, with a one-day, traditionally, school suspension just means a child's missing class, and they're playing video games, or they're on Facebook, or what have you, getting into more trouble, right? Okay. So if you don't know what ACEs are, those are childhood adversities. There's a list of those. They can be such as child abuse, neglect, drug use in the household, things of that nature. There's a long list. And those could all be impacting the way young people are showing up in school. Finally, I'll tell you, in a study that was recently published, we found that students of color with four or more childhood adversities were more likely than their white peers who also had 4 or more adversities to get a call home for problems they were having at school. So we found that certain adversities, or these complex adversities, were leading to problems at school. And so they were showing up in a way in school that led to the educator making a call home, right? That's generally a good thing. But we found that students of color were more likely to get that call home for their 4 or more adversities compared to their white peers. So we're digging more to understand exactly which adversities it is that are associated with a call home. But what we know is educators will be making a call home, right? As we know that young people are coming to school with difficulties, with adversities they've experienced at home, in their community, etc. So it's more than time to reform the way we do discipline practices. Thinking about trauma-informed care, this is from SAMHSA, And I love the Building Stronger Brains initiative, thinking about what that looks like, integrating that into restorative justice practices. And I think there's great similarity and overlap between the two. So, thank you.